Most of you were here yesterday, but we do have a handful of you that have joined us for today with day passes. I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Trelor Bauer, and I do work over at the Fort Collins Museum of Discovery. Dr. Frizen mentioned earlier that it's just too bad you can't live long enough to see how some of this stuff turns out. And that puts me to mind of Dr. John Cotter, or Jack Cotter, who was an archaeologist with the University of Pennsylvania, but was a student here at the University of Denver with E.B. Renault, and in 1935 led an excavation crew at the Lindenmeier site for the Colorado Museum of Natural History. Back in 1998, the museum did a short film documentary on Lindenmeier with Peggy Jodrey, and she interviewed Dr. Cotter. And in that interview, he said very much the same thing as Dr. Frizen. Gosh, it's just really too bad you can't live long enough to see how this all turns out. The thing is, there's always new discoveries, and none of us are going to live long enough to see how this all turns out. It's just a fact of life. But our next speaker this morning is Cody Newton. He's a PhD candidate at the University of Colorado, Boulder, and he is going to be talking this morning about the excavations that were led by Dr. Cotter up at Lindenmeier for the Colorado Museum of Natural History. So if you'll please welcome Cody Newton.
Well, good morning, folks. I just want to say there's probably going to be a bit of overlap in what I'm going to talk about versus what's already been talked about, but it's relevant to the history of what I'm going to present. And of course, if there's any discrepancies between what I say and what was said before, go with what I said. So I just want to start with this quote. I know we've spent a fair amount of time talking about Renault, but Renault made a short talk the other night before the Indian Relic Hobby Club in Collins and told them this Folsom business was a waste of time. And he had settled the whole problem in his first paper in 1931. You know, that being said, our knowledge about these ancient peoples is still being enhanced through archaeological study, and there's much to learn despite E.B. Renault's proclamation over 75 years ago. Admittedly, this quote and Renault's satisfaction are used here as a foil more than anything, as questions, methods, and theory have advanced, providing new data and knowledge that was beyond the scope of his time. Renault was the first archaeologist to begin systematic survey and cataloging of the archaeological record of the Western Plains and Central Rockies, as well as develop a typology for the forms of projectile points he documented. And for this pioneering work, he should be commended. Today, I'd like to step back into that time and talk about a part of the Lindenmeier site history, which was contributed by what was then called the Colorado Museum of Natural History, or the CMNH, now known as the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. I'd like to talk about the museum's involvement in the site excavations and describe what took place, and then finish up with some of the findings, particularly from the fruitful excavation of Pit 13. This talk will be more history and description and less analysis, as it is fitting given the platform of this symposium that we celebrate what went into the early archaeological work at the site and how the collection has influenced our thinking about Paleo-Indian archaeology, and fascinated all who see what the site has yielded. We all know that the Folsom Point is one of the most charismatic stone tools ever produced, anywhere at any time, but perhaps it is the rest of the material culture recovered at Lindenmeier that makes the site so important. Synonymous with Folsom, the Lindenmeier site was excavated from 1934 to 1940. However, it was not until Edwin Wilmson's monograph that a comprehensive examination of the Lindenmeier Folsom assemblage was presented. This work drew from the collection at the Smithsonian Institution, collected under the direction of Frank H. Roberts, Jr. Included in Wilmson's work was a short report written by John L. Cotter based on his fieldwork at the site in 1935. Cotter reports on the excavations carried out by the Colorado Museum of Natural History, and this remains the only published material regarding their work. Understandably, much less is known about the DMNS Lindenmeier collection, as Cotter's report is brief and contains little quantitative data. I was lucky enough to get to work at the site in 2008 under the direction of Dr. Jason LaBelle. In 2006. In 2008, as an intern with the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, I was tasked by Dr. Steve Holen to assess the Lindenmeier collection as to its completeness, particularly if there were artifacts missing compared to what was excavated. This involves some analysis, but mostly historical research and even a bit of detective work, looking at museum correspondence, pictures, and the like, which gave me a good sense of the history of these excavations and the importance of what the museum found at the site. It gave me an appreciation of just how rich this site is in terms of the numbers and diversity of Folsom material culture and its uniqueness to Folsom and Paleo-Indian archaeology. As part of the Colorado Museum of Natural History's deep involvement with early Paleo-Indian studies in the Great Plains and Central Rocky Mountains, excavations under the supervision of Museum Director Jesse D. Figgins were carried out at the Lindenmeier site in 1935. Previously, the DMNS had initiated the work near Folsom, New Mexico, wherein the association of a Folsom Point with the remains of extinct bison uncovered in 1927 unequivocally demonstrated that human occupation of the New World had Pleistocene origins. The DMNS was also involved in the excavations at the Dent Mammoth site, where eroding mammoth bone was discovered in the spring of 1932 and subsequently excavated that fall by Regis College geology professor Father Conrad Bilby and some of his students. A large basally fluted lancelet projectile point was recovered from within the mammoth bones. Bilby notified Jesse Figgins of the finds, and a crew from the museum excavated at the site in 1933. During this excavation, another projectile point was recovered and photographed in association with the mammoth bone, which proved to be the first rigorous documentation of these projectile points in association with mammoth. This find was not published nor widely reported, for it was later discoveries of the same projectile point types at Blackwater Draw in New Mexico, where they were typed as Clovis points. With this history of early and important work into what came to be known as Paleo-Indian groups, the CMNH was poised to carry out further work in the region, and when the Smithsonian began formal excavations at the Lindenmeier site, this Colorado institution became involved with the excavations of their own. It was one of the University of Denver anthropology professor E.B. Renault's former graduate students, John Cotter, who directed the fieldwork under the supervision of Jesse Figgins. Cotter, whose later work at Blackwater Draw would cement his place as an early Paleo-Indian authority, later became well known for work at Colonial Jamestown. As Frank H. Roberts, an alumnus of the University of Denver, had previously carried out work in the American Southwest, Cotter's work at Lindenmeier was an interesting and undoubtedly salient chapter to a diverse archaeological career. E.B. Renault was the first professional archaeologist to visit the site in 1930 and 31 and analyzed Folsom artifacts from Lindenmeier, which was discovered in 1924. The site was discovered by Claude and his son A. Lynn Coffin, along with C.K. Collins, and these men collected nearly 200 artifacts from the surface or near-surface contexts over the next 10 years. Roy Coffin, a geology professor at nearby Colorado A&M, who had collected at the site with his brother and nephew, brought the site to the attention of the Smithsonian through a series of letters. In 1934, Dr. Frank H. Roberts of the Smithsonian began excavations at the Lindenmeier site. Although initially disappointed with what he saw as a denuded surface site that had been extensively collected, Roberts found on the second day, quote, a layer of dark earth about 12 feet below the present surface. And after he had scratched around for about an hour, got lots of bones, midden stuff, several scrapers, and parts of 3 good Folsom points. The discovery of a buried paleosol and Folsom artifacts in the banks exposed by a down-cutting arroyo at the site oriented the location of the Smithsonian excavations. With the assistance of the Coffins, Robert opened up a major excavation into the arroyo bank at this location, which became known as the Big Pit. In the following field season of 1935, Roberts excavated a 10-foot wide trench due south, cross-cutting the Paleo Valley, beginning at the Arroyo Wall and the Big Pit. It was during this summer the Smithsonian work at the site was supplemented by a crew from the Colorado Museum of Natural History, at the suggestion of the site discoverers and agreed upon by Roberts and the Smithsonian. The CM&H excavations took place from June 14th to September 1st and involved test pit excavations throughout the site area. Cotter was tasked with determining the extent and depth of the stratum of occupation, or the paleosol that contained the Folsom artifacts. Cotter, along with Harley Gottschee and Robert Landberg, carried out the work alongside Smithsonian excavations that were under the direction of Roberts. 15 pits were excavated to this purpose. The Smithsonian excavators had priority placement of their excavations, so Cotter worked around these places during his excavations. Cotter began excavations in the eastern portion of the site by digging an initial test unit he labeled Hole 1, in which he encountered the dark paleosol at a depth of 8 feet, but failed to recover any artifacts. Following this, 3 more test units were excavated into the paleosol to the south, west, and east of Hole 1. These test units and a subsequent one excavated in the same area failed to produce any cultural materials. However, through this work, Cotter was able to determine that through the paleosol depths, that the contact dipped to the north at a rate of 17 inches and 10 feet. The 6th test unit, a 10-foot by 10-foot hole labeled Hole 6, in the same area did produce cultural artifacts, which included pieces of burnt bone, 5 flakes, and a point fragment. Following the delineation of excavation trenches by Roberts in the central portion of the site, their DM&S moved to the east of the trenches and sunk a test unit wherein they recovered no artifacts nor encountered the paleosol. Another test unit further to the east of the previous unit was labeled Hole 9 and produced 2 end scrapers and Folsom Point fragment. Work continued on the west side of the Smithsonian trenches. On the west side of the Smithsonian trenches, and in Hole 13, Cotter found the paleosol to be 21 inches thick and, quote, full of charcoal, stone chips, and scraps of bone. Consequently, this 10-foot by 10-foot test pit was expanded to a 30-foot by 30-foot block and block excavation that was divided into 9 10-foot by 10-foot units. From July 10th to August 26th, the DM&S worked on this portion of the site that became known as Pit 13. In this block, the paleosol was covered by about 5 feet of overlying sediments that were stripped for the most part by a team and slip. These block excavations, as indicated by the red arrow, produced over 97% of the resultant DM&S assemblage, and along with the chipstone artifacts, ground hematite fragments, a lignite bead portion, a hematite bead portion, a ground piece of limonite, an incised bone disc, and a grooved piece of bone were recovered. The chipstone assemblage also includes projectile points that type to later Paleo-Indian periods. Based on Cotter's stratigraphic provenience, the artifacts were categorized as either having come from the top of the paleosol near its top contact, or from the paleosol proper, or from the lower paleosol near the bottom contact, which he indicates contained 98% of the artifacts. The complete Lindenmeier collection at the DM&S, as it exists today, is composed of 461 artifacts, including 2 casts, one of a flake and one of a projectile point. Flakes and flake shatter, respectively, comprise the largest percentages of the assemblage. Tools, formal and informal, including 20 utilized channel flakes, comprise 64% of the assemblage. The high percentage and diversity of tools is characteristic of Folsom assemblages, and in this case may also be a product of the collection bias of the excavators. End scrapers, numbering 47, are the most numerous tool type, and edge-modified flakes, including retouched flakes, scrapers, and end scrapers, comprise over a quarter of the assemblage, and number at 116. There's also a significant percentage of Folsom points, preforms, and channel flakes, evidence of projectile point manufacture and use in the collection as well. The extant assemblage from Pit 13 alone includes 140 chipstone tools. Based on the currently identified raw material sources, there is clearly a bias towards locally available materials when expedient tools are being manufactured at the site. The chipstone tools tend to be more concentrated in the northern and eastern portions of the area, with the largest concentration of tools manufactured from local material in the Division I. And based on the percentage of points and chipstone tool density from the Pit 13 tools, there's clearly a pattern that ties with multi-use Folsom sites, especially when opposed to kill locations. As demonstrated by this graph, in which multi-use sites or occupations generally have a lower percentage of projectile points compared to other tools and a higher density of tools per square meter. As with the flakes, Cotter makes only limited mention of the quantity and types of bone encountered in the DM&S excavations. He specifically mentions the incised bone disc, which is pictured here, and a, quote, bone awl. Cotter describes a piece of bored bone coming out of Unit 13K, which may be the deeply grooved piece of bone shown here on the left, and that was likely being divided into needle blanks. And another reference to faunal remains at the site. Cotter states, quote, while trimming the north wall of 13A, we exposed a portion of a bison skull in poor condition, only the base of the horn core intact. In an earlier letter, Cotter lists 3 foot bones, presumably bison, and 1 foot bone, small animal, unidentified, as having been recovered out of Unit 13A. These are the only mentions of bone specimens particular to element, although he does say Unit 13 as a whole yield many, many scraps of bone. As well, in the report of the 1935 field season, a general description of the bone recovered is given. Cotter describes that all but the smaller bison foot bones were in fragmentary condition, attributable not alone to the deliberate breakage wrought by the occupants of the campsite, but also to the natural decay, which reduced the larger pieces to a powdery condition. He indicates that the bones do not differ from those recovered by the Smithsonian excavation in the bison quarry. A final note provided by Cotter indicates that rodent and even bird bones had been recovered, but at the time of his report had yet to be identified. Source analysis of the tool stone from Pit 13 resulted in both local and non-local sources. And just, that's Lindenmeier, and then these dots are locations of tool stone sources that have been documented. This figure shows some of the locally documented source areas in proximity to the site. The definite non-local sources, those that are greater than 20 kilometers from the site, are Ulitic Chert from kind of southwest Wyoming, northwest Colorado, Edwards Chert, Texas Panhandle, Jack Morrow Chert from southwest Wyoming, Alabates from kind of central west Texas, and then Flat Top Chalcedony from northeast Colorado. And then petrified wood and a porcelainite, which are common in kind of northern Wyoming. The definitive local source materials are like Lyons Formation sandstone, there's some pieces of groundstone, which I don't really get into. Morrison quartzite, there's a red quartzite, a gray chalcedony, and then there's secondary cobble cherts. There is a wide variety of material types present that are dominated by cherts and chalcedonies. In Pit 13, the local material is primarily the red quartzite and the gray chalcedony, which is found mainly in the top 2/3 of the block. Based on this analysis carried out by Dr. LaBelle and myself, the working hypothesis is that most of the unidentified lithic materials in the assemblage were local sources based on characteristics such as size and cortex. Although there are clearly exotic materials in the assemblage, the heterogeneity of the lithic materials represented indicates that many sources were exploited. Coupled with the identified raw material sources in proximity to the site, it is likely that these materials represent local procurement on a foraging scale. The use of local material, especially in expedient tool and early biface production, demonstrates that this site was being occupied for substantial lengths of time. 36 stone tools from this assemblage contain traces of ochre. accounting for about 12.5% of the Pit 13 chipstone tool percentage. Residue identification based on macroscopic and low-power microscopic examination of the artifacts shows that ochre is present in small concavities in material voids, angular flake scar terminations, and within low spots of flake scars, areas ideal for residue preservation. Tin chipstone tool forms, classified by their morphology and edge angles, have ochre present. Inscrapers and other scrapers contain the highest percentage of ochre, whereas projectile points, preforms, retouch flakes, and channel flakes have the fewest occurrences. A chi-square test comparing inscrapers and other scrapers against all other chipstone tool forms based on the presence or absence of ochre proved significant, suggesting that using ochre and scraping were associated activities. Other recovered forms of ochre include 5-faceted abraders, heavily polished and ground. The facets contain numerous fine, thin lines, suggesting abraders were rubbed or pulled along the edges of lithic flakes or tools, either to dull the lithic edge or coat it in fine powder. As well, the flake scars of a drill covered in ochre suggest that this tool, or another just like it, was used to drill the hematite bead recovered from the CM&H excavations, as the contours of the drill fit the bead interior with a near perfect fit. Finally, ground stone from Pit 13 exhibits hematite staining related to pigment processing. There are several possible uses for the red ochre that are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Functions might include symbolic use of red ochre, of the red color and the powder, as an ingredient for mastic or hafting glue, for decoration, and/or as a hide preservative. Hide processing was clearly a major activity at Lindenmeier, given the high frequency of inscrapers in the CM&H assemblage, as well as in the Smithsonian assemblage and coffin collections. Maintaining high-quality hides so that they did not deteriorate during the production process would have been a major concern for the Lindenmeier occupants, particularly in putting up winter stores. The ochre may have been processed with ground stone, preparing a fine powder to coat fresh hides, and then subsequently worked against the skin with inscrapers and other processing tools, coating these tools with residue. Wilmson and Roberts also documented ochre in areas 1 and 2 of the Smithsonian excavations, where they recovered 68 pieces of hematite, all of which showed evidence of grinding and faceting. Ochre is spatially clustered in close association to ground stone. Roberts' team also recovered a partially drilled hematite specimen and a piece of a decorated turtle plastron with traces of ochre, confirming fulsome decorative items in areas 1 and 2, along with Pit 13. Other distinctive tool forms recovered from Pit 13 excavations include gravers. There are 14 of these found in the DM&S collection, and the significant presence of these tools would indicate a diversity of activities was taking place in this area. Of course, there were projectile points and earlier stages preforms found in this block as well. And these would be the preforms, and then these are some channel flakes. There are 21 preforms and 24 channel flakes found by Cotter and crew in Pit 13, which indicate projectile point production was taking place at this location. The preforms indicate that points are being made out of both local tool stone, such as gray chalcedony, and non-local materials like Jack Morrow chert and flat top chalcedony. The coffin collection from the Lindenmeier site includes a large sample of 155 channel flakes, whose mean width of 15.23 millimeters is significantly different than the DM&S sample, which has a mean width of 17.82. The DM&S sample also differs significantly from the mean width of 15 millimeters of channel flakes from the Hansen Folsom site. The mean width of the Smithsonian Lindenmeier samples is 14.97, which also differs significantly from the DM&S sample. And also in terms of thickness, the DM&S sample differs significantly from these same collections. So the upshot is the Folsom channel flakes from the DM&S collection are thicker and wider than these others that they're compared to. And this also includes Stewart's Cattle Guard, Shifting Sands, and the Mitchell locality at Blackwater Draw. And based on some analysis of, preliminary analysis of use wear, there appears to be a threshold related to thickness that precludes a channel flake from being an effective tool based on the Pit 13 sample. There is a significant association between channel flakes that are thicker than 2 millimeters and those that are being utilized as tools. So the ones that are thicker than 2 seem to be used as tools more often than you would expect just by chance. Perhaps this may prove to be a discriminating factor, whether explicitly or implicitly recognized by the Folsom user. It is feasible that a certain thickness became recognized as necessary to withstand the forces generated for the task specified for channel flakes. Fluting, although it seems to produce a fairly uniform shaped flake, may have enough variance in thickness that not all channel flakes were deemed usable. The grooved piece of bone in the collection that is postulated to represent a piece of bone in the early stages of being turned into bone needles, bone needle preform, if you will, has a groove that fits precisely the utilized edge of the channel flakes, given their general mean thickness and the thickness of this groove, and then just placing channel flakes in there. There's a pretty nice fit. The profile of the groove in the piece of bone is V-shaped with a beveled bottom, which fits the profile of many of the utilized flakes that show retouch or significant use wear. The finished projectile points themselves comprise 15 of the tools found in Pit 13, and again, these are from both local and non-local sources that basically mirror the sources of the preforms. A comparison of length, width, base width, thickness, flute thickness, and basal concavity depth between the Folsom site projectile points and the DM&S Lindenmeier specimens indicates that the two samples differ significantly only in terms of the basal concavity depth. In the case of the basal concavity depth, it may show a stylistic difference that could indicate that the two were occupied by different groups. Probably the most distinctive and perhaps unique items recovered from Pit 13 were the beads. As mentioned before, a hematite or ochre bead and a lignite bead were found, along with the incised bone disc. These are decorative or at least non-utilitarian items that demonstrate a portion of Folsom material culture rarely seen at most sites. The Lindenmeier site and the collection of the Denver Museum of Nature and Science provide a window into the daily lives of people living there 12,000 years ago, not only through the subsistence-based artifacts, the projectile points, the scrapers, but through the artifacts that undoubtedly had intrinsic value, such as the incised bone disc and the various beads, which give these people a humanity that bison bone beds and projectile points do not always provide. The likely reuse of the site and discrete activity areas indicates that a sense of place was important and powerful. I would like to think about how Lindenmeier's site has influenced not only our thinking about Folsom and our Palean Indian groups, but how the site leaves those who have seen its artifacts with a more profound connection to the study of ancient humanity. Thank you.
How does the use of ochre during the Folsom period compare to the use of ochre before or after the Folsom period? And can you give a sort of summation of maybe diachronic significance of ochre?
Jason, are you laughing over there?
Is that what he wants you to do for your PhD?
Well, it's stuff that he and I had worked on, but there is ochre use both before and after. I think we can talk about it a lot more here just because of the sample we have. We'd like to, at some point, actually try and source some of this stuff because there has been work done with that. But yeah, I mean, as far as its many uses and why specifically it takes these forms here and not there, I think there's a lot of work to be done with ochre for sure.
Because it's quite interesting in Europe during the late glacial, the final 1,000 years of the Pleistocene, you actually see ochre come up in certain horizons, and actually one of those is GS1, the Younger Dryas. So,
well, that's Interesting. I'm not, I guess, real familiar with that. I apologize.